and welcome to the first in our series of podcasts with Dr. Stephen Davies, Head of Education at the Institute of Economic Affairs. As both a historian and a futurist, Steve has a pretty unique take on things, and over the next few weeks we'll be hearing from him on a whole range of topics. Today he's going to explain his alternative view of history. Steve, you've argued that we're teaching and learning history in completely the wrong way. We're memorising useless facts and neglecting the most crucial moments and advancements in the process. That's quite a damning indictment. Where are we going wrong?
Well, I believe very much that the way we teach and learn history in this country, and indeed throughout the world, is deeply, deeply flawed. Now, here's why I think this. History really matters. There are many people who think that historical facts, the study of history, these are just an idle waste of time for ignorant old buffers like me. But actually, history is profoundly important. It's important in one sense, in that we are the creatures of the past. The kind of people we are and the kind of world that we live in is the product of the past and is created by the past. So inescapably, we are the children of that past, and we have to live within the bounds it's set for us. But also the way we think about the past, the way we study it, the way we understand it is enormously important. The stories that we all have in our head about what went on in the past and why it went the way it did tend to shape and determine, without our being aware of it, the way we understand and react to events now. So, for example, the common story that most people have in their minds about what happened in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, that there was an unchecked capitalist boom in the 1920s, and then this went completely off the rails, and Franklin Roosevelt had to ride into Washington and put things to rights. That kind of story tends to shape the way we react to events in current times, like the financial crisis. So history really, really matters. Now, if you were to go to most people with even the most average or basic education, you would find that there's a certain number of dates that most of them will recognise. They'll know what they refer to. The 4th of July 1776, for example. Almost everyone will recognise that as being the American Declaration of Independence. The 14th of July 1789, even people who don't recognise the specific date will know that this refers to the French Revolution. In this year, I think most people will know that 1917 is the year of the Russian Revolution. Many people will know that 1215 was the year of Magna Carta. These are the kind of dates that are basically embedded in the popular mind. Now, if you look at that list of dates that most people know about, what do they have in common? They're all about politics. The dates that people remember are typically to do with the accession or the decline or fall of rulers, of politicians, of people who exercise political power. Or, as those three dates indicate, they're part of a story about the emergence and development of the modern state, about the way that political power has changed over time, how it's come to be used, and how the political system, and above all the modern state, came into existence, why it has taken the form that it does, and the kinds of ideologies that have supported it. So this is a story in which politics and power and the use of power is absolutely central. But these are not the only important dates in history. There's also several other different kinds of lists of date. And I'm going to go through a few others. And I would argue that if you want to actually understand how and why we live the way that we do, these other dates are, if anything, even more important than the first set of dates. But these are dates that almost nobody knows about, and the people associated with them are also largely unknown. So one date, for example, is the 26th of April 1956. Some people, given this date, might have think it was something to do with Suez, for example, or an event of that kind, but actually it was the sailing of the first ever container ship from New Jersey to North Carolina. This was the brainchild of an entrepreneur called Malcolm McLean, who had observed that the amount of time it took to load and unload goods from ships onto trucks, he was a truck entrepreneur, took longer than the entire time that the goods spent on either the truck or the ship. And he came up with a simple but brilliant solution, which was the container, that you packed all the goods into standard uniform sized containers that could then be carried on a ship and straightforwardly unloaded onto either a railway car or put on the back of a tractor unit. It cut down the cost of moving goods around the planet dramatically By the time all the infrastructure of container ports was built, it had reduced the cost of moving goods around the world by a factor of 30. Just think about that. It means that to move goods from, say, Australia to Britain now cost 1/30 of what it had done before. It was that simple breakthrough that led to the huge growth of world trade in subsequent years. The internationalisation of the world we live in now, where you can go into a store on any street in any part of the world and see products from all over the planet. A world in which people think nothing of buying cut flowers that were in Kenya recently, or food that has been grown on the other side of the planet. It was an amazing transformative breakthrough. Another date is the 22nd of January 1970. That was the first commercial flight of the Boeing 747, the jumbo jet, the brainchild of a brilliant series of engineers at the Boeing company, particularly one of them, a man called Joe Sutter. They undertook a project which on several occasions came close to bankrupting the company. They had to build what at that time was the world's largest ever building near Seattle in Washington state, so big that clouds could form inside it. They had to discover several entire new technologies to do it. And they were only saved by the vision of another great visionary entrepreneur, Juan Trippe, the man who ran Pan American Airways, who signed a contract guaranteeing that Pan American would buy a sufficiently large number of 747s to persuade the banks to renew Boeing's credit line. And what did this do? It transformed the world of air travel. Prior to then, air travel was expensive and a luxury good. Only the really well-off could afford it. Suddenly, it became a mass product, cheap and available to people on average incomes. It created, again, a world in which almost everyone has travelled somewhere outside their country by the age of 21 or 22. Before 1970, most people had never travelled outside their home area by the time they were 40 or 50, unless they were members of the upper 10% of the income range. So the globalised world, the world of mass tourism, the world of mass interconnection between the world's great cities, that was made possible by Joe Sutter and his team at the Boeing company. And then another date, which I think for women is probably the most important date in the whole of human history, the 15th of February 1961. That was the date on which the Food and Drugs Administration in the United States gave a license for the sale of the contraceptive pill for dealing with reproduction as opposed to alleviating menstrual pains, which is what it had been allowed to be sold for 2 years before then. Now, that was the product of a number of brilliant scientists, but also a remarkable woman, Catherine McCormick. She was a long-time feminist, suffragette, great campaigner for women's rights in the United States. She was also independently very wealthy because she was one of the McCormicks. She was the heiress to the International Harvester manufacturing fortune. And she funded much of the research that was led to the production of the contraceptive pill out of her own private pocket, because she knew just how important this was for women.
Yeah.
Because until this point, all women throughout history had been basically the slaves of their biology. Their social options, the chances they had in life, were incredibly constrained, because unless they gave up regular sex, sooner or later, in most cases, they would become pregnant, and they would then be tied by the child that they'd given birth to. And so the advent of cheap, reliable, safe contraception was a revolutionary breakthrough for women's lives, women's prospects. But again, how many people know that date?
Yeah, I don't think this point can be made strongly enough. When we're looking at the historical experience of women pre-widespread contraceptives, we have to almost imagine that, for the most part, married women are basically in a perpetual state of pregnancy between the ages of about 20 and 40. And it's no coincidence, I think, that so many of the successful women you get in this period, from Jane Austen to George Eliot to Florence Nightingale, are women who never married, never had children, because constant pregnancy makes it impossible to get things done.
Yes, absolutely. Spinsters typically are the more successful women. Essentially, women have to make a very painful trade-off. They have to give up the joys of marriage or sexual companionship or a family if they're to succeed in life, because otherwise their biology constrains them radically and fundamentally. And all of those three dates I mentioned involve fundamental changes in the everyday lives of ordinary people and a radical reconstruction of the world. And there are others I could have mentioned, like the first transatlantic telegraph message, for example, in 1959, which shrank the world dramatically. There are many, many cases like this. And it's worth saying that this is a very profound gap in our knowledge, and it reflects what we think is important. If I was to show people photographs of Hitler, Stalin and Mao, I guarantee you that everyone would recognise them. Now, those were three men who, between them, killed nearly 100 million human beings. An unbelievable amount of human suffering.
According to some estimates, they've exceeded that number. I've heard 60 to 70 for Mao, and then I think World Conquest puts it at 20 million for Stalin.
And about 10 to 11 million for Hitler, yes. Yeah. It's an incredible figure. Now, on the other hand, if you showed anybody a picture of Norman Borlaug, I guarantee you no one would recognise him. Now, who was he? He was the great plant scientist and geneticist who brought about the Green Revolution. And in 1970, he got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And Greg Easterbrook famously said in an article about him that he was the man who had saved 1 billion lives because he brought an end, maybe temporarily, but hopefully permanently, to the threat of world famine. Now, why is it that when we think about history, everyone knows who the mass murderers, the tyrants are, but very few people know about or would recognise people like Borlaug or Joe Sutter or Louis Pasteur or many other great entrepreneurs, scientists, inventors who have made the world a better place. And it's because, and this is my sort of main point about this, we think that what matters, the thing that shapes the world, that drives the world, is politics and the use of power. And that's why we pay attention to the people who have it. But actually, the message you should get from these other dates is that what really shapes history, what really drives the world, is peaceful exchange, trade, invention and discovery. That is what really drives the world, creates the world that we are in. Politics, if anything, is simply the kind of parasitic behaviour that holds that back. And so we should be building statues and naming buildings after people like Pasteur and Borlaug and Sutter, and not having all these statues of men on horses who typically are put up there because they were successful in war or in building an empire.
That's fascinating. I mean, I suppose we are hampered by the fact that more often than not, those same warlords and despots are the people that have control of the funding streams and the kind of patronage that leads to statues being built and so on.
Well, maybe, but it also reflects something else, I'm afraid, which is that in the modern world, sadly, most education is done through the state. And the kind of history that is taught through formal education is driven ultimately by the interests of the government. And it's no coincidence that most governments in most parts of the world are interested in ultimately teaching a kind of history that will promote loyalty to and support for the established political order. They're not interested in teaching people to think about history in a way that will lead them to maybe think that their own importance, i.e. the importance of the rulers, the people with power, is not as great as they would like to think it is. They don't want that kind of free thinking. So this sort of support for the funding streams ultimately derives, I think, from the consciousness, the perception of the world that people have, which is shaped partly by formal education, partly by things like films and culture, the wider culture and the like.
Yeah, I mean, if I see another History Channel programme about the 6 wives of Henry VIII, I will scream.
Yes, exactly.
So, in some ways, we really haven't moved on from the kind of great man view of history that Thomas Carlyle was writing about in the 19th century.
Yes.
And the transmission of history is essentially overseen by politicians who, you argue, have a tendency to exaggerate their own importance. Do you think there's also an argument that it's simply easier to teach children to be interested in things like royal intrigues, wars and battles? Or is it essentially that there's something more fundamental going on here, a rather statist worldview, a statist assumption that the big changes have to come top down from a government rather than from pioneering individuals in the free market?
I do agree that lots of people, particularly I hate to say young boys, are very interested in wars and conflicts and battles. There is something very dramatic about the court life of the Tudor period, for example. That's why it does make a great drama subject. But on the other hand, I think people would actually find the stories that I've just outlined equally fascinating and interesting. The story of the Jumbo Jet is incredibly dramatic. It's a story of endeavour against the most amazing odds. There are all kinds of other things which are really interesting, and I think people do find it interesting to discover just how things that they took for granted, like mass air transit or the mobile phone or everyday plumbing, for example, came to be. It's a fascinating subject, I think, for all kinds of people. So while people are interested in war and politics, I think they would be equally interested in all these other things as well. I think it's just the sort of inertia, if you will, of modern popular culture and above all the state education system that leads to this kind of story not being told so much. And there are others too. You could equally tell a story about art and the discovery and development of different art forms. You can tell a history of the world through the history of diet and cookery, for example, where you would realise that actually the most important country in the world for that is Portugal, which is not what most people would realise. But yes, there are different stories that you can tell about the past, but at the moment only one story is being told, and that's the story about power.
Steve, you gave us a number of crucial dates, but those were all from the 20th century. So the development of contraceptives and the shipping container. What about going back a little bit earlier than this? So let's take, for example, the medieval age. The dates that we learn at school, you've mentioned Magna Carta, but there's also 1066 and all that, 1381, Peasants' Revolt, and then the Battle of Agincourt. What do you think that we should be learning instead?
Well, in the Middle Ages, or indeed any time before roughly the 18th century, there are lots of dates like the one I mentioned, but we don't know exactly when they are. Because the problem is, although there were major technological breakthroughs or major innovations in business, in trade, in commerce, in medicine, and all those kinds of things, they weren't recorded. So in most cases, we can't actually put a particular person or date to it. So, for example, we do know that at some point in the 3rd or 4th century AD, a genius in China invented porcelain, which is an enormously important discovery for world history and world economic history, but we can't say exactly who it was. We can only then subsequently trace the history of it. Similarly, in the Middle Ages, there are very important dates, like the great developments and breakthroughs in Gothic architecture. The major breakthroughs which you find first in the great cathedral at Chartres, later in the other French cathedrals in glazing, the creation of stained glass, the ability to build enormously tall buildings which previously had hardly been known since the Roman period, and not even then perhaps. But we can't actually identify precisely when these were made. But we should teach a history, I think, which has more emphasis on those kinds of things, upon the ways in which in periods where you might think nothing much was changing, actually all kinds of innovations were being made.
And perhaps because we've been so conditioned into this great man view of history, we almost need to attach a face or a name to an invention for it to stick in your mind so much.
Well, I think actually in some ways I would still adhere to something like a great man theory. It's just a question of what counts as a great man or woman might be a bit different.
Yes.
There has to be enormous vision, great determination in the face of obstacles, great insight for people to create these new inventions or new discoveries. So I mentioned Louis Pasteur. He had to face down the most intense opposition from all of the established scientists of his own day to prove the truth of the germ theory of disease. That required enormous personal qualities, and I doubt that anyone without his amazing egocentricity and megalomania, quite honestly, would have actually had what it took to do it. So in some ways I think that there is something in the great man or great woman theory of history. There are outstanding individuals who do things. At the same time,
and outstanding despots as well.
Yes, indeed. So there are certain people who have particular qualities and who may be in the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time, and who therefore have a huge impact on history for good or bad.
Steve, thanks very much.